knowing that if you're going to start to really get into it, it doesn't mean that you have to take it that far. Someone doesn't have to take it that far, but just know that maybe you're opening up to maybe a more risk of that happening. So again, being aware and making informed decisions about what you're taking in and why you're taking it in. Welcome, everyone, to Reclamation Podcast, a beEmboldened initiative. If you are new to us, I am Naomi. I'm the founder and executive director of BE, and we exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse. We are committed to providing support for the prevention of victimization and revictimization, creating a safe space to ask questions, to heal, and to rebuild. You can learn more about the resources and support services we offer by visiting our website at beEmboldened.com. For today's conversation, we are going to be talking about a pretty popular topic. We're going to be talking about the Enneagram. For those of you who don't know what this is, please stay tuned because we're going to start from the beginning and give you a footing. But for those of you who do, you may have some questions, or maybe you have some missing pieces of information that would be helpful for you to know about. So we're going to talk about those too. In order to do this, since I am not an Enneagram expert, I've invited an old Densem friend of mine, Jay Medenwaldt, to join us. I'm going to give you a little background on him first before we jump in. Jay served in the Air Force for 9 years as a behavioral scientist. He has an MDiv in apologetics, ethics, and biblical studies, which is not an easy feat, y'all, in case you're wondering, an MA in psychological sciences, and he is in his final year of a PhD program in social and personality psychology. His ministry focuses on incorporating psychological science into apologetics, and he is currently writing a book on the Enneagram for Lexham Press, evaluating it from a theological and scientific perspective. His wife, Lindsay, also does apologetics, and they have 2 daughters, ages 12 and 9. And you guys might be familiar with Lindsay because we have had her on, I think, twice before. So Jay is the other half of this powerhouse couple. So excited to have him here. With that, I'm going to jump right into this first question, you guys. Number 1, to ensure we're all starting out on the same page, what is the Enneagram, Jay? Because some people may have heard of it or heard people reference their number, but they may be unclear as to what it actually is.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, I suppose, because I find often with any type of contentious topic that people often have different foundational ideas about what something is before you even start. So at the very kind of broad, big picture level, the Enneagram is a personality test, but what the people who use it would say is that it's even more than just a personality test. It's much more in depth than that. And so, well, I guess test wouldn't even be the right word. It's a personality system. So it's got 9 different types. So Ennea is the Greek prefix for 9. So 9 types is essentially what the name is. And so there's 9 different personality types according to this. And the Enneagram explains what each of these types are, and everyone is one type. And it also explains the connections between the types. So you can be, if you can picture the image of the Enneagram, the picture you've seen of it, they're arranged in a specific order that has meaning. And so if your type is a 5, you can have a 4-wing or a 6-wing, because those are the two neighboring types in the order. And then your directions of growth or stress, which is where you would go if you are healthy or in an unhealthy state, would be for a 7 or 8, based on those lines that connect. And so it's very specific and detailed as far as how all the different types relate to each other and what that says about you and your personality as someone who would be a specific type. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm following you. So, and I'm picturing the image, and for anyone who watches this on video, I might see if we can add an image in so that you're able to see it. So if you're listening to this, either Google it or, check out our YouTube version to see if we've been able to insert it. But yeah, when I picture the diagram, so I didn't realize though that what I was looking at visually was how things would connect. It does make sense to me that when I'm on vacation, I can present differently than like when I'm under stress for a deadline. So it sounds like what you're saying is the way it connects is it would tell you this, you're more like this number under stress, you're more like this number when you're healthy, you're, feeling good. And then the wing one, I've heard of that too. So that's sort of your, how would you explain that? Like kind of secondary predisposition, supposedly?
Yeah, kind of like that would be a good way to say it, or you could say maybe even kind of like a subtype.
Okay. So that makes
And there's also the triads, or I guess depending on different language centers that sometimes are used, where it's divided up into three sections, where you've got the 8, 9, and 1 as one type, the
Mhm.
2, 3, and 4 is another kind of type, and then the um, 5, 6, and 7 is another type, and that would be based on kind of like a thinking style or the way that you process or reason things. So it would be kind of like um, the language it often uses, like gut, heart, or head, or intuitive thinking, and emotional. So that would be
Mhm.
another kind of layer that it adds to personality, or tries to add to personality.
Got it. Okay. So you had mentioned, so first of all, I mean, it sounds kind of complex and like it covers a variety of scenarios or maybe seasons in people's lives is maybe how I would put it, depending on what's going on. But you mentioned that Ennea is, you said 9 in Greek.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what are the origins of this? Does that connect at all? Like the fact that they're using a Greek word, or do you mind backing us up a bit?
And so some of the people who use it, they will give this long, detailed explanation of the origins of how it originated thousands of years ago. Some will say, in like Greek culture, even predating Greek culture, Egyptian culture. Um, some will back off that or start to claim that it was maybe more early Christians who developed it or things like that. But
Okay.
really, there's no record of it at all anywhere until the 1900s from a guy named George Gurdjieff. He's kind of a Russian mystic, kind of self-proclaimed philosopher, and he essentially came up with a symbol that he may have cobbled together from various different kind of belief systems,
Mhm.
including like numerology. We see that in the numbers and how they're connected. It's based on kind of numerology. So,
Mhm.
like 1 divided by 7, and then you get that repeating if you divide by. So 1 divided by 8, 1 divided by 7, 1
Mhm.
divided by 5, 4, 2, and you get that. That's where it connects all those lines. Well, then you see the connection between the 3, 6, and 9 would be
Okay.
different. Why there's that triangle. So
Mhm.
that's based purely on numerology. But it came. He kind of developed it as, or came up with it as this idea to explain everything. So he said, you don't know anything unless you can explain it in terms of the Enneagram, whatever that was supposed to mean.
Oh, wow.
But
So he
then
took
it
it all the way.
was right, and then but then it was just very kind of still nebulous and abstract, and it was Oscar Caso and Claudio Naranjo in South America in the
Mhm.
1950s or so, who were maybe a little before that, who developed it further into then specifically personality, and they came up with the personality types for each one, and how that works with growth and stress and having wings and all that. That's where they added that onto it. And so it wasn't until the mid 1900s is really when it was developed. Duran Ho says in an interview that he developed it through automatic writing, which is
Mhm.
where you essentially allow some sort of spirit to write through you.
Mhm.
Uh, some people who are fans of the Enneagram will say, well, he didn't say that to anyone before that interview.
Mhm.
So he was probably just exaggerating or fabricating that, or that he wasn't referring to automatic writing in the spiritual sense, but more in the physical sense of just kind of being in a kind of relaxed or unconscious state where you kind of
Mhm.
write freely from your unconscious thoughts. Doesn't quite seem to be the case from what he says in the video interview. But either way, I tend to think that even if he thinks he was communicating with a spirit of some sort, that it was probably just his own unconscious thoughts that came out. We have a lot of different psychological experiments of people claiming to be communicating and talking to the dead through things like that, that we can explain through very um, very easy, simple, easy to repeat um, physical methods. So, for instance, like a Ouija board. We've been able to replicate where people think they're using their Ouija board, that they're being led by a spirit, but we know it can be led and done by one person specifically in control, even if they don't know that they're doing it. So little things like that. I think we have good reason to think he probably wasn't actually communicating with a spirit. And he does also say that what Oscar Ocasio received about the Enneagram also came from a higher spirit, but he doesn't elaborate on it more than that.
Okay. So it sounds like you would pose then that it's most likely it's something that they just sort of would make up be too far. Now, I don't know these gentlemen's backgrounds for their professions or anything. So do you think it was founded in any kind of research or knowledge they would have gleaned over time and then just sort of wrote it out? Or do you think it was just more so maybe made up in the moment?
Yeah, so Caso does say he came up with it through automatic writing and through his own observations, and he was a psychiatrist.
Okay.
So he does have some training there. He allegedly did some work in personality with some pretty big names in the field of personality back in around that time. But I haven't been able to track down and receive verification yet of whether he was actually there, because even some of the people who are his followers, I guess you would say, are into the Enneagram, will admit, like they do with that video, that he was prone to say exaggeration. So trying to find information of whether or not he really did work with some of the kind of the pioneers in the field of personality psychology or not. But even if he did, he doesn't seem to really have applied any of the actual empirical methods that they used to develop the personality test we use in science to the Enneagram. It seems more based on his own kind of intuition and knowledge, and same with Akazo, where they were kind of basing it on their own thoughts, but not maybe making it up completely, but just based on things that they happen to observe themselves.
That's so interesting. I don't want to go too much down a rabbit hole because I could. So I'm gonna put the brakes on, but I have one more question about this piece of it. So when the Russian gentleman, I can't remember, what was his name?
George Gurdjieff.
Okay, the original person, had he applied any sort of meaning to it at that time? Because you said then these two wrote it in, basically filled it out as to what it meant for personality types. Do you know what its original purpose was? Did it have one?
It really was an attempt to explain everything. So like literally everything. Like, so presumably
Okay.
it would mean personality, but also like he talked about the motion and movement of the stars and
Oh, wow.
things of the
Okay.
universe. So like everything in the universe.
Okay.
That's his idea, and he made the implication that there would be some level of personality or that you could get from it, but it was really just like one line in his book. And it's not even his book; it was one of his followers wrote a book from his teachings after he died. That's what he made, one kind of passing implication of there being connected to personality, or that we should be able to get some personality insights out of it, but that it was just kind of a passing comment.
Interesting. Okay. So then they did quite a bit with it. Now we've done quite a bit with it. So, all right. Well, I want to move into how this is now being used. So, as you know, of course, areas of the Christian church, others as well, but Christian church we're going to talk about specifically, have embraced this, as a supposed tool, which can add to, I think, the confusion for individuals who are maybe navigating this topic and are wondering, like, is this good or not? I mean, if the church is using it, we would tend to be more predisposed to saying, okay, it's probably fine. As a professional who's, very close to finishing his PhD in psychology, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on its accuracy? Is this something that you would recommend?
Yeah, so yeah, I kind of share your thoughts there about kind of where you'd say in many situations, like if people want to use it, fine, or not, like whatever, it's up to them. But I think there is the biggest benefit that can come from it is the people who are using it. I've seemed to notice that they do have a much higher level of awareness that people are different. People are just very fundamentally different, which often gets forgotten in larger culture. We see a lot of people trying to dictate and make rules that kind of imply that everyone should act this way or be a certain way. And I don't think God has called us to that. I see that in Scripture, in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, 1 Corinthians 9. People are different, and God wants us to be different and expects differences. To some extent, that doesn't mean, it's okay for some people to be sexually immoral and some not. But there are differences in personality, what we like, what we prefer, things like that. And so that's a really good, I think, positive that can come from it. But that's just a general kind of awareness. Once you get into the actual types and look at what the claims are of each type, there's not really any accuracy. There's been quite a few of people who have tried to test it. All of them are in favor of the Enneagram. And I say this because you can tell through their hypotheses. So when they say using the Enneagram, and I expect it to find that people who were trained in the Enneagram will be more self-aware or have stronger identity or have these outcomes, they're predicting the Enneagram will work. There was one study out of all, there's probably 100 studies, give or take, probably a little more when you include dissertation and thesis projects. Only one of them that I'm aware of actually made hypotheses against the Enneagram, and they were testing the idea of the wings. And so he hypothesized that people would not organize the Enneagram in types according to how the wings and the organization is laid out. And he was right. All of the others where they're testing the Enneagram, essentially, like, either they don't really get what they were expecting or they get mixed results. So they say, for example, one said that thought that all 9 types would score according to their thinking style, right? As I talked about with the 3 different thinking styles. And I think only 1 out of the 9 did. That was the type 5s scored in a more rational thinking style than other types, but all the others didn't really match what was predicted. So you've got very limited support for the system as a whole. You get a little bit of mixed results here and there for some of the claims, which you would expect with something that's kind of random or has a very small degree of accuracy. But in general, it's just really inconsistent as far as the ways it's tested, how reliably it predicts people's personality, their behaviors, their outcomes, how reliably people score on the same type when they take it more than once, how reliably different versions, so different testers will type someone. So kind of really low levels of reliability for that.
That is so interesting. So for listeners, I want to point out something that Jay did at the beginning, which of course he would have done as a good researcher, but I want to point it out to all of you. When you are looking at assessing something, we want to do so in a critical way. And when I say that, I don't mean, oh, we're being critical, like we're being judgmental, we're being like, I don't mean it in that way. I mean, we really want to be aware of any confirmation bias that we maybe have, any area where maybe we're prone to having some cognitive dissonance about the information we're going to receive. And when we're looking at studies, when we look at the hypothesis, like Jay mentioned, and we see that it's like going in that positive of, I think this is going to happen, that can show us that this person probably thinks positively of what they're doing research on. They're expecting a certain outcome. It's a great place to start. It doesn't have to be a problem, but it is helpful to see. I would say that if someone is coming from it from that angle and they're seeing it as, okay, I think this is going to work, and then they find out it doesn't work, Jay, let me know what you would think about this, but I see some real honesty in that study.
Yeah. And I would say, so with the research on the Enneagram, it's a lot of it is kind of low quality.
Okay.
And I say this just because, so for instance, one study by Daniels, he's an actual psychiatrist, but so you would think you would know better. They report that there was no differences between their groups. So they had a group that was trained in the Enneagram for a short period of time, which he used as a control, and a group that was trained for a long period of time. And so they were expecting stronger effects for the group that was trained for a longer period of time. Well, they found that there was no differences between the groups.
Okay.
And so then they go on to a next step. And so within each of those 2 groups, they had several subgroups. So groups that were trained in small kind of batches at different locations and places. And then they did comparisons on all those groups and found that one of them in the group that did the longer training, one
Mhm.
of them was had the effect that they were looking for, and so then they reported that they had support for their hypothesis, even though it
Mhm.
was only one group and it was a small difference, and um, they didn't compare it with the other groups. They just compared
Mhm.
pre and post test, right?
Okay.
So if so, I don't do therapy, but for those psychologists that do, if they're seeing a client for depression, usually what's going to happen is if that psychologist does nothing, the person's depression over 6 weeks or however long it is probably going to get a little better, regression to the mean or some level of
Mhm.
improvement or growth in normal development, right? And so you have to have those proper controls for pre and
Right.
post test, but they didn't do that kind of control. And
Okay.
so they just, what we call in science, we would call this phishing, or sometimes referred to as p hacking, or we have different terms to describe it, but essentially it's where you're fishing for an outcome you're looking for. So
Mhm.
there's that type of thing a lot, but there's also, I'll say, pretty honest reporting from what I've seen as far
Mhm.
as pointing out and reporting when things don't work out the way as expected.
Mhm.
And often what the studies will do, and there was even a review that came out a couple years ago, what they fall back on over and over again is you see is that they'll kind of report and say, but future research could help this problem, or help make things better, or might look in a different direction. You see that over and over, and there's been research now ongoing on the Enneagram since the early 80s. Is when kind of Wagner, I think, was the first peer-reviewed article on it.
Wow.
So
Okay.
40 years of research now, and it's
Mhm.
still really not getting any better. Maybe a little bit on some of the things. And I will say also, um, my point, I didn't come into doing Enneagram research to critique it,
Mhm.
and I got involved in it originally just to try and figure out if it's accurate, reliable. And one thing I've noticed is that even some of the researchers themselves don't always seem to understand the Enneagram and how to test it themselves. And so,
Mhm.
not coming at this from me being critical, but
Mhm.
more in the sense of thinking through and testing the Enneagram on its own claims. We have a lot
Mhm.
of ways to test different scales or measurements or claims in psychology, but the
Mhm.
key is that we want to test things based on the claims that they're making. And
Mhm.
so, for example, a common test that we use for every scale that's pretty much ever used is called Cronbach's Alpha. It's a reliability measure. So essentially, do you have questions on a survey or questionnaire that are expected to correlate highly with each other?
Mhm.
So we run this and we get a value, and we have kind of rough cutoffs that we say, okay, this is a reliable test and this is not.
Mhm.
Usually that cutoff's about zero point 0.7.
Okay.
So we use that on everything: intelligence tests, personality tests. If you take a test and you want to find out if you're impulsive, or if you're conscientious, or if you have a growth mindset, or all these different things, we
Mhm.
use that same thing. Well, what's unique about the Enneagram is it claims that for the different types, that really only the scores for each type should correlate highly. So type 1 makes a lot of claims and says, here's all the attributes of type 1.
Mhm.
Okay. So the
Mhm.
researchers, what they've done is they've just looked at this alpha score for all the questions about type 1, but and again, the results aren't great. They aren't really favorable for the Enneagram. And these are researchers who are like the Enneagram. But what they should have done to be more specific and actually give the Enneagram a chance on its own terms, and this is what I'm planning on doing as I'm collecting some data with the Enneagram and looking at,
Mhm.
is look at the alpha score for just type 1s versus everyone else.
Mhm.
So type 1s, they should have a high reliability score for the type 1 questions.
Mhm.
Everyone else may or may not. It's
Mhm.
irrelevant because it doesn't really matter, because the Enneagram doesn't claim that everyone is going to have these attributes that correlate with each other for type 1s. It's only type 1s.
Mhm. Yeah.
Maybe that was all a lot and too much and confusing, but the
No.
takeaway point is that ultimately, like, even the point is that the research that I'm doing, I'm actually trying to, and what good scientists do, not to say I'm necessarily a good scientist, but I try to be, uh, test things on their own claims and not kind of make up and test things that aren't being claimed by a tool or researcher or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And also, I mean, maybe to oversimplify, but that sounds fair.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
Try to be.
Well, and I guess the way I think about, okay, why does this matter? And for everyone who's watching and listening, like we're about to head more into that. And I think it matters in proportion to how much weight someone's putting on their number. I think that's really where it's like, I mean, how much weight are we putting on it? How much are we allowing ourselves to think through that lens of these numbers? And if we're doing that heavily, okay, well, what is the research saying? Like, should we be giving it that much influence in our lives? And so I'm curious, like, do you find it to be harmless? Like use it or don't use it, doesn't really matter. Do you think it does pose a risk to identify, or like I was saying, maybe like depending on to what degree you're identifying, maybe it poses a risk? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I definitely think it does pose a risk as far as how frequently or for how many people. It's hard to really say. I've heard a lot of people who use it and like it
Mhm.
will admit that they see people use it in what they would say inappropriately, to say selection for jobs, or to say to excuse
Wow.
behavior, and so to say,
Mm.
well, I do that because I'm an 8, or I would do that because I'm a 1, or this is just how I act because of my thing, and use it in that way, which I think pretty much everyone would kind of agree that that would be not a good way to use it.
Mhm.
Uh, the problem is the Enneagram claims that your type is always your type, and that's always who you're going to be. And the best you can do is to essentially try to cope with it or try to overcome it.
Mhm.
So that's really difficult. And on top of that, it claims that it's going to, or that it does reveal things about your personality that you don't know yourself. And so if it says you're extroverted, but you've always
Mhm.
thought you were introverted, but it's like, oh, well, this was right on all these other things, and I guess I must be extroverted. And now you start trying to act more extroverted, or you start gravitating in that way. Like maybe for some people that might be positive and help them come out of their shell and blossom, but for other people it might lead to them acting in inappropriate ways, or um, make maybe some of their issues that they have worse, or
Mhm.
um, lead to them excusing behavior.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe they're with their spouse and they want to go out, and there's, because they think they're extroverted, and then say they, now they have to act this way and their spouse doesn't want to. And so it can create issues. A
Mhm.
lot of it hypothetically, because a lot of it hasn't been rigorously tested as far as what's happening,
Mhm.
who's how frequently. So there's a bit of a gap there. Um, and so yes, it's hard to kind of say for sure. The other part, though, that often sometimes gets overlooked, and it's where some of the people push back as critics, where often they'll say, they tend to go to criticizing it based on its origin and referring to it as demonic, which I think
Mhm.
is the point a little. But often you'll see then the people who are promoting the Enneagram or using it or writing books on it, they don't always have the best theology, or aren't um, always the best thinkers. So a lot of what
Mhm.
they're promoting or talking about is not necessarily always based on truth. It's more of anecdotal, experiential. Um, we don't necessarily have to get into whether or not they have right or wrong theology, but it's that
Mhm.
pattern of kind of thinking and not being concerned with truth. For me, it's like, why would you want to promote product from those people, from people who are
Mhm.
teaching others and encouraging others to think and act in that same way around their theology and what they consider as true as well. And so that's something that we don't often think about either, because we often think that we are good enough to kind of evaluate everything rationally and we're not influenced by things. But the reality is that we are very heavily influenced by a lot of things that we don't consciously aware of. And so you might get into, say, Richard Rohr because the Enneagram. You say, well, it's just the Enneagram, but you find that maybe you like the way he writes or his humor, or that he's used such a great tool that you like in the Enneagram, that then you start reading some of his other books and materials and you gravitate toward that because you've already kind of built that connection with him through the Enneagram. And it might not be him, it could be any other teacher. Then
Mhm.
it would be the same for, say, prosperity gospel, health and wealth teachers. And it's the
Mhm.
same kind of method that is often used in um, toxic environments or cults or whatever, where people will build rapport and connection, or sales, like car salesmen, over things that are irrelevant, that don't really matter. And that allows them to have more power and control over people in other domains as well.
Hmm. Yeah, you just made several really good points. I'll start with what you just said. Absolutely. I have clients, I would say semi-regularly, where all of a sudden, and we'll be meeting and they'll hold up a book and it's someone like Richard Rohr, for example. And it's like, oh my goodness, have you read this? And I'm like, whoo, okay, so let's talk about that, because yes, people have the freedom to read what they choose to read. My hope is that they'll know what they're reading, that they'll know this person is in a certain camp. And so know that they're in that camp, so that you then are weighing that information and you're deciding what you're going to do with it. I mean, of course, within the context of people who have experienced religious abuse, we don't want them going into situations uninformed where they're getting influenced and they don't know who's influencing them. They don't know what stance that person has taken, or maybe what distinctives others would make about that person. Again, so just being aware, being informed. It doesn't mean, like, I'm not going to tell them you can't read that. I wouldn't recommend it, and here's why. Or if you're going to read it, I'd recommend reading it through this lens, so that you're, again, critically assessing as you're going through it, and you're not taking it all as like, oh gosh, this is gospel truth, because it's probably not. And with some of these authors, it's definitely not. So yes, and I think what you're speaking to there is that the Enneagram, whom it's really strongly embraced by, can lean in some of these further directions, like progressive Christianity or prosperity gospel, heading in these other directions. And so knowing that if you're going to start to really get into it, it doesn't mean that you have to take it that far. Someone doesn't have to take it that far, but just know that maybe you're opening up to maybe a more risk of that happening. So again, being aware and making informed decisions about what you're taking in and why you're taking it in. There's information that I have to take in. I'm sure you do, Jay, when you're talking about apologetics. I know Lindsay has needed prayer at times for deep, dark holes she's had to go down for research. There's times where we go in directions for a specific reason, but we're doing it for a specific reason. And that's something that I like people to think about is, okay, if you're heading in this direction, what's your purpose for doing it? And then decide if it's worth it or not. Because we can just land in some places that are not ideal and can wear on us sometimes from the inside out. Now, where I have felt some confusion myself, to be honest, is some of the claims about the Enneagram being demonic. And I'm like, this seems to me, I'm like, well, I don't want to dismiss if the origins seem to fall in that area. If we were talking about like a spirit telling someone to write something, I mean, we want to practice discernment here. Of course, scripture tells us to do that. We see the importance of it, hopefully, especially those who have experienced religious abuse in different forms. We see the risk there. And yet, it can seem like, is that being blown out of proportion? I mean, is it something that we actually need to almost be fearful of? And I'm like, it seems like if we feel like we have to be afraid of the Enneagram, we've taken it too far. And it sounds like you're maybe in agreement with that statement, but would you mind responding to that?
Yeah. So the claim that's demonic is largely because it was the people who came up with it were not Christians, and they were claiming to be communicating with spirits. So because they weren't Christians, then the claim is that then it must have been demonic spirits and not God or something else, especially since it's not revealed in Scripture. I think God can speak to non-Christians. I don't think he did for the Enneagram, but the point is that we don't necessarily have to say it was demonic just because it came from non-Christians who claim to be communicating from the dead or with spirits. I think it's, again, probably they came up with it from their own kind of observations or unconscious thoughts, not any sort of spiritual being. So I don't think we have to worry about it as being demonic in that sense. But I guess the part that sometimes gets people is that it will seem often eerily accurate. And so it's like, well, it had to have come from like, a spiritual dimension or something like that. And that's where people can sometimes be like, oh, well, it described me so well. It was eerie. It gave me goosebumps. And I hear those claims a lot. But that part, that actually comes from a testable, repeatable psychological bias we have. It's called the Barnum effect or Forer effect. And this was first tested 70 years ago. And so essentially the first guy to test it was Bertrand Forer, which is sometimes you'll hear it called the Forer effect, where he gave his students a personality test and then gave them their results. And they rated how accurate the results were. The results were just like 10 statements of general statements about personality. They
Mhm.
all got the same results back, but they all, except like 3 out of 30 students, rated it as like very accurate or extremely accurate,
Mhm.
perfectly accurate. So this range were really high. And so even though they all got the same results back, and they got these, we call them Barnum statements, these broad general statements that pretty much apply to everyone.
Mhm.
Uh, that's what their personality results were made out of. They described it as really eerily accurate. And I do this when I teach on the topic. I'll give people personality tests and I'll give them these same results back, and people will say, "Oh, this was eerily accurate in the way that it described me." But again, it's just because these are things that pretty much describe all people, but we don't always realize that they do, that they
Mhm.
describe it because they're about internal thoughts or things we don't often talk about. So, say some of our sexual thoughts or desires, or how we are often conflicted. So one of the statements is something like, um, "I'm I'm often introverted or like to stay be by myself, but um, I frequently like to go out and be social." So that's what is called a double-barreled statement. So
Mhm.
it's both sides.
Yeah.
Well, we're all like that in many ways. And so you have a statement like that. It's like, "Oh wow, that described me so well." Well, what it did describe you well because it described everyone.
Right. It's
You
so
know,
distinctive. Mhm.
you have statements like that, it seems really accurate. And so then there's that part. It's like, oh, this is so accurate. It was eerily or like creepy how well it described me. This must have come from a spiritual dynamic or force of some
Mhm.
sort. And so I think there's that kind of just adds fuel to the fire of the kind of questionable origins as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense that that would happen because it seems like it's so accurate that something is influencing that, whereas in reality, I think what you're speaking to, I'm gonna reflect it back to you in my own terms, let me know if you think I'm on it or not, but we like to know about ourselves, and some of us like to know about others too. I'm fascinated by human behavior, it's why I have a leaning in that direction too. So we like to, but there can be more of an interest in self. So we want to understand ourselves, we want to make sense to ourselves, we want to be able to explain ourselves to other people. And I'm going to put a little like asterisk on that because I think we also can appreciate being able to explain ourselves to other people without having to be super vulnerable. And I see tests like the Enneagram as an example, offering that to people where they can say kind of seemingly a lot about themselves without really saying much. They just give a number. And I think there's a little bit of a distance and maybe a sense of safety and, oh, I'm sharing about me and I'm getting to kind of talk about myself and make sense of me to someone, but I'm not really actually saying a whole lot. And if there are any assumptions made based on that, I could always come back and disagree if it seems like that was received poorly or negatively instead of maybe how I wanted it to be. So I see there as being like a built-in buffer at times when we explain ourselves in these ways. And I definitely see the pro of that, or the reason someone would do that when they have come out of, say, a religiously abusive environment, and trusting someone is very scary and it feels very unsafe to do. And so it's a way to maybe start a conversation and bridge that gap without having to really sit down and, over coffee and really talk and get to know one another. It can be an easy start, and I think that can be one of the things that people appreciate it about it in the context in which I'm serving.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point because I often say that. So the question people will sometimes ask me is, well, if it's not accurate, why do people like it or think it's accurate? And so one, I'll say not everyone does think it's accurate. A lot of people will tell me and confess to me like they thought something was wrong with them because it didn't just seem to describe them at all. But they didn't feel comfortable sharing that with other people because people either gave them weird looks or everyone was raving about it, and they just didn't feel okay to do that. And so they've kind of told me that because they felt I was safe because I've said it's and pointed out how it's not accurate. But on the other hand, as far as why does it seem to work, or why do people like it so much if it's not? And I think what it offers is a lot of things that you don't get in other places. So it allows people to feel like a unique individual because of the complexities of it. But it also, at the same time, allows them to feel as part of a group. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. Like I'm an individual, but I'm also part of these other people in group, and I have connections, right? And that's with people of your same type or people who also like using the Enneagram. So there's kind of both ways with that. It also, and then as you pointed out, it kind of allows people to be vulnerable, but it also allows them to kind of keep the guards up and be safe because they can always say, well, this is my type and this is not something I'm saying about myself. It's what this other thing is saying about me. So I can be open about that and kind of reveal some of myself to people in that way of being vulnerable, but it also allows people to kind of keep the gates up and be protected. Say, well, I'm not like that all the time, or I'm working on that, or I've overcome that, or whatever, so that they can still keep that distance from other people, so they're not completely vulnerable. So it's got a lot of these kind of effects where it allows people to get kind of a both and kind of situation with connecting to people. I think that's one of the reasons why it also is so popular. I would say the other part is that it allows people to know other people as well, or at least feel they do. And it also kind of allows where there's kind of a sense that, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought here, where um, I guess we'll have to skip that. I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Well, what I started to think of as soon as you said, and maybe this will bring it back to you, you were mentioning how it helps us to know other people. And I think that can feel safer for us too, because if we know someone's number, we suddenly have some sort of context for how they are as a person and we can make sense of them. And it's like, okay, this person feels more known now. And if they behave this way, maybe I'm not going to take it personally. It's just their personality. And so I think it removes some of those unknowns, at least supposedly it does, or we're hoping it does. And so I could see that being something that people would see as again, as a pro to using an Enneagram number.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely helpful. And that's arguably is one of the things that we are least comfortable with at all, is things that are unknown or uncertain. So it gives us that feeling of knowledge, even if we don't actually have it.
Yeah. So for people who have come out of, say, a high control group, and so, I mean, maybe a cult, maybe, maybe not, maybe their term would not be cult, even if it would, check all of those boxes. But if someone's come out of a high control group, I mean, oftentimes they don't even know how they like their coffee. I mean, they really don't have a sense of who they are as in their unique design. They don't necessarily have a sense either in who they are as identity in Christ first and foremost. But speaking specifically to those just nuances of them as an individual, again, uniquely created, they're trying to get started and figure that out. And it can be a really daunting process to engage in, not only because of the spiritual connections that they're, afraid of and things like that, but just really like, I don't know, like this is just always what I had to do. And I was never allowed to do that stuff. So like, I don't know if I like it or if I don't like it. I have women wearing pants for the first time at 40 years old and seeing if they want to color their hair or not, or, so all of these different aspects of just what do I like, not, let alone a sense of agency, but as people are kind of stepping into this, do you think that there are personality tests, that personality tests can have a place in it? Do you think that there can be a benefit to it? And if so, where would you put maybe the Enneagram in relation to other options?
Yeah. So there is some use for personality tests. We use them a lot in science to predict behaviors or control for things or whatever. And I say control for just to mean like we remove the effects of. So if I want to try to predict how well someone is going to do in college, right? The best predictor is going to be IQ, their intelligence. But right next, like the next biggest predictor after that is going to be conscientiousness, which is basically how like orderly and self-controlled they are, right? So if I want to really figure out and predict someone's outcome, I would need to include conscientiousness, which is a factor of personality, into my equations. If I don't use that, I just won't be as accurate in predicting the outcome.
Mm.
And so there is certainly a use for that. Um, we can do that kind of in a mathematical way with pretty high degree of accuracy with personality tools like the Big Five would be, there's 5 factors of personality, or the Hexaco, which uses more or less the same 5 factors plus an extra one. Those are pretty much the only tests used in science to try to predict behavior because it's just far and away more accurate than anything else. Not every factor is always relevant for everything, and sometimes there's things that are left off of those that are predictive of behavior in certain situations. And so it takes a lot of knowledge for specialists to kind of know what's going to be relevant or not based on research. But as far as where the Enneagram falls, I would say it would be um, way towards the bottom of the list. It's not very accurate. So I'd say if you're looking at just the type, like how well does a type describe a person, just again, not the connections or lines or wings or anything else, just the type, I would say probably based on the research, give it about a C. So not very good, but not terrible. I think there is some degree of like the types probably describe people a little bit at that moment. Now, once you start to get into some of the other claims of the Enneagram, such as your type will never change, the wings, the connections, then I would say on every other thing like that, I would say it probably gets an F and fails. And those are the things like over and over again in all the research, it just does not show that it's doing any better than randomness. And so it's just really kind of low level of reliability and predictability in all those different ways, where it's all pretty much completely useless. Again, this is based on people who thought that it would be useful for research, testing it and finding that no, it's not working out the way that they thought. So you use something like the Big Five, lots of versions of the Big Five, or the Hexaco, you're going to get pretty helpful predictive results in terms of like how easy it is to connect with a significant other or spouse, or how well a certain job might suit you in terms of how much you like it. But keep it in mind that for a lot of those things, there's a lot of other factors that are way more important than personality. So let's say you want to be, say, an accountant. It would probably be really good to be conscientious as an accountant, right? Because you're paying attention to details and order and organization and all that, right? So that would probably be really important. And if you're not conscientious, does that mean you're going to be bad at that job or you won't like it? Well, it depends. Maybe you just really love numbers or spreadsheets. I actually do. I get caught in time warp when I work in data sets, working with spreadsheets. It's kind of a crazy thing that most people don't get. So if you're like that, you really like that, maybe an accountant, it would be a good career for you. So these aren't often, people shouldn't be probably making big decisions based on personality alone, because oftentimes personality is not a really strong predictor of outcomes. Like maybe it can be a little bit useful, but even then there's always exceptions. So if you're really passionate about something or have a strong interest in it, even if it goes against, say, your personality, you could still be really good at that job, or you might still really enjoy the job, or even a spouse. So in some research, so finding a significant other, like we hear in pop culture, kind of conflicting things. We hear birds of a feather flock together. We also hear opposites attract, right? Well, which is it? Well, typically, usually the more similar you are in personality, the easier the relationship will be, or more likely it will be to last. But there's lots of exceptions, and it also, say, depends on what we call interactions with different variables. So if both of you are high in openness, right? You're both high in openness to different experiences, then you have that one similarity, then a lot of other similarities, instead of creating conflict like it would with people low and openness.
Mhm.
Those other differences might be excitement and adventure and things that bring you closer together. So there's always kind of little factors and nuances that matter where, unless you really understand the research behind some of this and thought about it probably with a professional, like it's probably not really a good idea to be using personality tests at all, even accurate ones, to make big decisions in your life, unless it's maybe just one of several factors.
Mm. I have a couple thoughts to follow up from that too. So first, because I don't want to forget, the two tests that you mentioned, Hexaco and what's the other one?
Big five. So
Big
big
Five.
five is often referred to as, you hear it as the 5-factor model, the big five. The Neo is a version of it that's used, or the Big Five indicator is a version that's used. So all these
Mhm.
are often used together, and it's the 5 factors. You can remember it with the acronym CANOE, or ocean.
Okay.
So using ocean, it would be openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Okay.
Neuroticism sometimes is called emotional stability and
Okay.
turned in a positive way. The Hexaco uses those same 5 factors, but then it adds a sixth one that's called honesty, humility, and it's kind
Okay.
of, so it's debate about whether or not that's really a separate factor or just kind of a combination of a couple of the others, but those are by far that's the dominant view of personality that's used for research. If you were to, so even like the Myers-Briggs, which a lot of people are familiar with, where you got like the 4 letters, there's 16 types, that's almost never used in research, and it's just not very accurate either. And really, with any kind of personality system thing, that if it's dividing people into types,
Mhm.
there, that's automatically going to make it less accurate, because if someone's just close to the line on the kind of a cutoff, they're going to sometimes score in one versus the other, or act in different ways. And then if they're in the middle on, say, 2 traits, then it's really problematic. And so you lose a lot of accuracy when you categorize people like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've experienced that myself with my Myers-Briggs results from
Yeah.
like, and sometimes it depends on who I'm with. It's like,
Right.
well, if I'm with my husband in a social situation, I'm gonna seem less extroverted than I am because I kind of like balance him out because he's very extroverted. So, yeah, it's more nuanced than that, which I think is really cool. I mean, it speaks to really how unique we are when we take an entire person and you put it all together. It's like, yeah, you can't just stick us in this one box. It's just, and that's really neat that we've been designed that way. So it keeps us interesting, keeps life interesting.
Yeah.
But with those two, can either or both be self-administered, or would someone need to meet with a psychologist to take one? If anyone's
Yeah.
listening, curious.
Yeah, you can use, I mean, there's some paid versions, but you can find free versions online.
Okay.
Hexaco, the people who created that, actually have a website, so you can take it on their website. And there's
Mhm.
free versions of the others that are all pretty reliable. Um, the problem that people often report when they get those results is the results don't seem to mean anything for them, which is, I think, one of the other reasons why the Enneagram has been so successful, is because most personality um, um, tests or whatever, they're just very descriptive. Here's kind of your general tendencies. The Enneagram goes a step further and kind of prescribes behavior, and
Mhm.
so I think that's part of it. The draw is you get a description, but then you get prescription, but it's something that's not kind of forced on you either. So that's that other thing I was thinking about before, with
Mhm.
kind of that balance where it comes across as kind of the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
So when you get the results that you would get from, say, the Hexaco, you have to do a little bit of work or thinking about what that actually means. So that you're low in extroversion, so that would mean you're introverted or more introverted, right?
Mhm.
What does that actually mean? Or things like that. So I think Jordan Peterson, actually one of his students, developed a personality test, a very highly cited version personality test, and they've done some unique things with personality. And so he's actually part of their doing research now and marketing and promoting a
Mhm.
paid version. I think it's like $10 or something, where they try to add some of that extra information as far as giving insights into behavior and prescriptive type of behavior. So they're doing a little bit of that, because the other part of it, that where there's some research going now is to look at people's range of scores on a trait. So it's not just that maybe you scored in the 50th percentile on introversion, right? So you're not an introvert or an extrovert, but maybe you had a really wide range of scores between the different questions. And so that would likely mean that you're very comfortable as an introvert or an extrovert, depending on the situation, where someone who had a very narrow range of scores, maybe they're less comfortable in situations where they have to act different. And both can be adaptive depending on the situation or people when it's going on in their life. And so some of the research is going in the way to recognize that and use that information to help people.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There was someone that came out of a cult, had been raised in it, so like 30 some odd years. And she reached out to other people that came out of the same subgroup of this cult and was like, hey, let's take the Myers-Briggs. And now I know you're saying that one's not as accurate. Still, I just want to share this with you. I thought it was really interesting. It's an area where I'm like, maybe I need to go get a PhD because this is what I would want to study. Is she said 14 of 17, if I am remembering that correctly, 14 of 17 people who they had all just been out pretty recently, they got the exact same personality type. And it was whatever the most rare one is, where it's like the very, very low percentage of people actually get that one. And it would have been like, what, 80%, 85% of them had gotten it. And I'm like, that's so interesting to me because they're coming from a high control indoctrination kind of group.
Right.
Where they're all told how to behave and how to act, and they all have to be very submissive. And so they're all introverted and they're all, and I'm like, gosh, that's so interesting. And I'm like, I would love to see what they score 10 years later.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's something. So an advantage that the Myers-Briggs has over the Enneagram is that you do get scored on a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do kind of get the idea of like that you fall maybe in the middle of types, but then it kind of categorizes based on type. And so where it becomes less reliable is that for people in the middle, they're going to change types a lot. And if you're in the middle of multiple types, but then if you actually do the paid version of the Myers-Briggs, you actually get your raw score, so you would know if you're kind of in the middle.
Okay.
And then the other thing is the Myers-Briggs only has 4 factors that roughly align with the 5 factors of the big 5. And so if, that is another way where it loses accuracy, but I would encourage that the Myers-Briggs is probably a little more accurate than the Enneagram, especially even if you have 16 types versus 9, you're probably going to do a little bit better job of explaining behavior as well.
Yeah. I think where I want to land us for today, this was the other kind of thought that came to mind when you were talking a few minutes ago, is I think part of what people are looking for, and I could say this bigger, but I'm going to keep it again in the context in which I spend most of my time, which is the context of religious abuse. So people are looking oftentimes for a sense of affirmation that it's okay to be who they are. And again, and I'm not saying that as in like, it's okay to be sinful or it's okay to do awful things. It's okay to, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just very basic, like, it's okay to not like to go for walks as a group. It's okay to want to volunteer in this department versus that department. It's okay to want to be successful at work versus volunteering all of my time to the point where I can't even hardly support my family. It's okay, to one example I give for me is I had to put syrup on cream of wheat and I had to put brown sugar on oatmeal. Like literally I'd get yelled at, and it's like, it's okay to switch it up. If you want to put blueberries on your oatmeal instead and not have any brown sugar at all, you can do that. If you want to put whatever on there, you can. And so, I mean, from these simple, more silly things to like bigger stuff of like, gosh, I want to go in this area for my vocation versus that, which is all that, maybe women were allowed to do as an example. And I think that can be part of what people are looking for when they have come out of this kind of background, is they are seeking something to say, it's okay to be me. Now, not like I don't want to keep going in the sanctification process, but like generally speaking, like it's okay. And they haven't heard that. And I think sometimes the personality test is where people maybe turn to seek that. And so I'm curious, what would you say in response? And feel, if you put on your MDiv hat for a minute too, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good insight. And I think that's something we struggle with, as to say, like for me, that First Corinthians 9 is really important because it talks about, Paul says, I become all things to all people so that I might win some. The implication is that people are different, so he has to be different, at least in some ways, to reach them. Or Romans 12 and First Corinthians 12 both talk about, different parts of the body. They're different, but they all serve the same body, and it's different roles. Again, the implication that people are different, and it's okay to have different likes and interests and desires and all that. And so, yeah, I would say be okay with that. And the other part is, I guess, don't feel like you have to judge or critique other people for the way they are. One, you might actually be critiquing them in a way that goes against what God has planned for them, which would be bad. But two, um, it's not always your place, right? So, um, I don't go around critiquing people on their personality because I think they should be a little less extreme in their whatever personality, whether they're too extroverted for my tastes or too introverted or too conscientious and not conscientious enough. There's some people in my life, I have a place to talk to them about those things. I do that when appropriate, not all the time. But the other part is, like, some people have different comfort levels of different things. And so one person might be, so imagine you have two identical twins, so they're same exact personality. Um, and they're both very high on neuroticism. For one, that might be really problematic based on their spouse, their friends, where they're living, maybe what is concerning to them, their religious beliefs or other beliefs. It's really problematic for them to be high on conscientiousness, and so they might want to work to change it because it's creating problems for them. But the other, maybe it's not creating problems, or might even be adaptive because it helps them get their work done or things like that. And so they wouldn't need to try to adjust it. So a lot of that falls on how we want to shape our personality or lean into it. Either way, depends on whether or not it's having or creating problems in our lives, and something we should be considerate of for ourselves and others that we do life with.
Yeah, I think, gosh, I think my summary of this conversation, sort of what I'm walking away with, is to the degree to which the tool we're going to use is as accurate as possible and is actually helpful to us, fine, go for it. But I would caution people from jumping from one box that they were stuffed into to putting themselves in a different box, and just maybe grow in comfort and acceptance that there's a lot of room here to be who you're going to be. And again, Christian worldview, like identity in Christ first. And then we look different, and it's okay for it to be different. It's okay for some things to serve us in some contexts, and maybe in other contexts it wouldn't serve us. I think about that with my son. I'm like, his energy serves him great when he's like trying to play a sport in gym class, when he's like playing it's great. When he's got to sit at the dinner table, he's got to sit at a restaurant with other people, it doesn't serve him as well. So it's like, okay, now I've got to kind of funnel this in a different way, or I got to contain it, or and so we learn these different ways of operating in these different environments and circumstances. And so, yeah, I would want to just caution people of, yes, we have some helpful tools, let them be that, but maybe they sort of get our brain going and get us started. But I would be cautious to let them overly define us, because then I think we're almost doing something similar to what maybe our high control group already did to us. And maybe it's just not that black and white. Maybe there's just a lot of gray, and the gray is good and it's okay. And we can just let it be that and see again where God takes us.
Yeah, that's great. I would just give one more maybe caution. Psychologists use this experimental procedure called the minimal group paradigm, where essentially they'll try to find this, like, the minimal kind of importance thing that they can get to unite people together. So it might be that, oh, you were both from the same state when you came to the lab, or you both have the same eye color, or things that are completely arbitrary. You both got heads when you flipped the coin, so we put you on a team. So completely random, arbitrary things. And when they do that, people they'll get people in lab settings to show in-group favoritism, which then by extension leads to discrimination against outgroups. And so I would just say the other thing with the Enneagram is that it's become kind of a socially acceptable way to stereotype people, which can lead to discrimination, whether it's people who like it and people who don't, or people of this type or my type versus people of a different type or people of this triad. So I would just caution, be very careful about using any tool, thing, personality or otherwise, that um, stereotypes people and might affect the way that you think about or treat people based on that in or out group kind of identity.
Gosh, yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. So yes, we don't want to use them to stereotype. And also, I think you mentioned earlier, oh, what was the other thing you said? Now I lost my train of thought. We don't want to use it, as an excuse for poor behavior,
Right.
essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's use them at least, for what they're intended to be used for and have those cautions. Thank you so much, Jay. I mean, we could keep going, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. And I hope this conversation is going to be helpful. I think it is. There's a lot of questions about this out there. I know that's why you're doing research on it. That's why you're writing a book on it. And when that book releases, do you have a scheduled date? Do you have a release month for it?
No, I'm hoping to finish it up this summer. So
Okay.
it depends on how well I write it, I guess.
All right. Well, you got a dissertation to finish too,
Yeah.
so you're good, man. No rush. You take the time that you need. But it'd be fun to have you back on after that's out and hit some highlights from it for people.
For sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.